So thank you all for coming and taking part. We'll go through a brief introduction here and do some sharing and offer some insight, I think, that will help us on this journey, especially for those from the settler population who may not understand or may not have had connection to the reason why a lot of our communities are in crisis and continue to be in crisis, and what's going on with our people. So this is a session that we're going to be talking about intergenerational violence, lateral violence, and some of the prescriptions around healing. And so this will be an opportunity to ask questions, an opportunity to listen, an opportunity to give testimony from our people who are gathered here, and share at this time. And we will try to do this in the first section here to give some presentation, to give some grounding. And then after that, we'll maybe take a short break. I like taking breaks in between this because it's a heavy subject. And so when we come back, we'll then do a lot more sharing and asking of questions. And that's a chance to get some perspective on these issues. So today is Orange Shirt Day. It is the day of remembrance. And here, as we gather in the Treaty 7 area, we gather on the territory of an amalgamation of people. And so we all live in and had been living in connection to one another in some way. I am from the Stoney Nation. We are me, my brother John, my sister Teresa, my sister Gloria, are all descendants of the treaty signers that happened in 1877 at Blackfoot Crossing, part of the contingent there. And so we are descended from that commitment. And we always, when we meet, we call upon those commitments and the recognition of that to remember that we are meant to be in community together. We are meant to be working together. We are meant to find some way to relate to one another. And in the work that we do and the work that we participate in, we give voice to those connections. So on behalf of the Stoney people, we welcome you to this area. On behalf of the Stoney people, we welcome you to this country, and that we have lived for 143 years for this particular treaty in peace with this country. We have tried to do our work and our involvement in building community for that time. And though we don't often see the fruits of that, each one of our generations have struggled to try to build a better foothold for the next generation. And so as we gather here, we remember that this idea of community extends beyond the groups of that's strange. So as I signed out. So that extends beyond the European settlers, and it extends into the other immigrant and people who come from different lands to be part of this. And what I always say is that those people coming here are part of the fulfillment of that treaty, because we open this land and connection to all. And it isn't one particular group that holds sway. We try to be accommodating to everyone, because that's what the Creator wants of us. And so I will turn to Bev for an acknowledgement, land acknowledgement from her place that in what is now called British Columbia.
Hi, Teresa. I'm Beverly, Squamish and Heiltsuk. So I originally come from Squamish and Heiltsuk First Nation here in British Columbia, but I live and reside in the Katzie First Nation. So I acknowledge the lands and territories in which I live and reside. Hi, thank you.
Thank you. So just a bit of background on what the Orange Shirt Day is all about. The efforts to find a connection here is, or the efforts to find a solution to some of the ill will began when the first inklings of the Indian Act began the residential school system. There was a education portion of that, and at that time, the work centered around trying to assimilate. And so on the Stoney Reserve, I often talk about the Morley being a place where there was a better connection between the residential schools and the people. The Stoney people would bring their children to the mission house to be educated. And this was something unique amongst nations. And that was the first settlers first contact with the missionaries that existed. And that was in 1873. By 1875, the missionary John McDougall requested a school be built to help house the kids who were there, and an orphanage for them to stay in. And so this was the beginning. As the bureaucratic focus changed to assimilation, they brought in more teachers, they brought in a superintendent, they brought in other people that then turned it into a different type of institution. At the same time, we see from the Anglican Church a number of forays into the Blackfoot and the Tsuut'ina community. In the Catholic Church, similarly in the Blackfoot and the Tsuut'ina communities, there were residential schools set up there. For the Morley community west of Calgary, the only group remained that Methodist community at the McDougall United Church, or the McDougall Church, which was a Methodist church. They set up an orphanage and day school in Morley that ran until 1969, when it was dismantled and taken apart. There were other instances of day schools that existed after that, and the Red Deer Industrial School, which was one of the major institutes in the Methodist Church, and where a lot of the Stoney people went through. It was, in the picture above, you see that institution, the very draconian place where a lot of students died. And so the impact of those indoctrinations and that assimilation, that wiping out of culture and tradition and language, impacted those families for generations. It basically disabled the ability to carry on our kinship and our ceremonies, our cultural ties, and created what we see today. And so at that time, there was a push to try to clean that up and to clarify or to fix the relationships as they existed. So what will...
Tony?
Yeah.
Tony, it's Margaret.
Yes.
Is it okay if I ask a question?
Maybe if you can put it in the chat, and we'll go through this first portion, then we'll ask questions in the second half.
Okay, for sure.
Thank you. So if we can, I'm going to mute everybody, and we'll go on to Teresa in this next portion, and she'll give a presentation there, and then we will and this portion will be on the intergenerational trauma. So
hello.
Yeah, there you go.
Okay. Hello, Dagun Chawa Amba Washte, Miet Wagia Wia Washte, Minitni Wia. Good day. My name is Pretty Eagle Woman and Coldwater Woman, and I live in Minitni, which is known as Coldwater, otherwise known as Morley, Alberta. I work as a contract trainer for Nietzsche Institute, and so when they need to send trainers out to teach the addiction courses to the NAIDAP workers or others in the field of substance abuse, I'm one of the trainers that they'll send. I also do work on grief and loss, traditional parenting, and I worked at our shelter here, and so I train shelter staff on the danger assessment training because I reframed it in 2010, 2011 into a holistic model, and so I go out and train those shelter staff so that they understand the importance of a holistic and Indigenous ideology. So that's a little bit of background on me, and I'm going to go through this intergenerational trauma wheel that we have set up because of the historical impacts that our people experienced throughout residential school. We see it evident in everything in our lifestyles today, in our families, in our own experiences, in our coworkers, in our relatives, and it's that intergenerational, it's that cycle of trauma, abuses, unfair justices, deaths, all these things that are compacted into what makes up intergenerational trauma. So I'll start first with child welfare. Or no, I'm going to start with family violence. So with family and lateral violence, because our people were being oppressed by foreigners coming in and having the control and basically taking away our culture, our identity, our language, our belonging, we began this thing of lateral violence because we couldn't oppress back to them, the oppressors, we did it to each other. And so lateral violence is when we do the sabotaging of our coworkers, our family members, rumors, family feuds that came about 20 years ago and the families are still fighting, and it's being carried on and nobody knows what the original fight was. And so the lateral violence in the workplace, you'll see a high turnover rate with workers. Also with that family violence, the sabotaging, the blame, the shame, the guilt on family members, things that are put in place, like now we have the Indian Act, or we have status, non-status, Métis, Inuit. We have all these divisions of names and labeling, or even like if you're a treaty in this area or that area. And so it's basically, we've learned the colonizers' ways of doing things, and we've taken it on and we practiced it to oppress our own people so that we have more, we feel more. And so it's more of a ego-driven and not heart-driven and not spirit-driven. And that's what we originally were. We worked from the heart, from the spirit. If someone were born into a community, they were accepted. Now you have to get you have to fill out an application, you have to get a birth certificate, you have to get so many votes. It's just all these things that are compounded that are very different from the Indigenous way of doing things. Next, we have child welfare, because a different way of thinking came into place. After residential schools ended, there was the onset of child welfare coming in, apprehending the kids, seeing that the kids weren't having the basic needs or the things they needed, and so they were apprehending them. But a lot of times they didn't look at the kinship of where those kids could go within the family. And a lot of kids were adopted out into different countries, had no connection to their ideology, to their language. I had worked up north and I had to do some work with some youth, and they were taking karate classes and Ukrainian lessons. And these were little boys of Cree descent, and I didn't understand why they weren't taking Cree classes and things about dancing that would help them identify with who they were. And so we see instances of this in the community. And so it's just things that aren't always the best, because when we come in and we try to save a group or save a nation with our ideology, we're not saving them. We're putting more things on to them that they really don't need. And we should really be working with them, seeing what works with them within their family, within their teachings. And then the next part on it here is the mental health. We'll see a lot of instances, especially now with the pandemic, people not being able to do certain things, being closed off, being isolated. There's anxiety issues, people with PTSD, people with complex PTSD. And you can also see that with the epigenetics of intergenerational trauma. So if a person had gone through trauma in life and hadn't resolved it, those patterns, those things will resurface in their children, and it'll go on. And those are callings or things that they feel like, why do I feel like this time at this time of year? Maybe there was a horrific incident that happened and that person doesn't know, but their DNA, their epigenetics is kicking into that memory, that trauma memory, that of what occurred. And so those are things that we understand with the Indigenous ideology and a way to counter that, a way to help with coping through that. And so I can't see this next one. Is there a way to move this screen over, Tony? Oh, okay, there I go, okay. And then, so with that, the mental health and seeing if the people are okay and just checking up on each other. And I see a lot of people doing that now, checking on people, just say, hi, how are you doing? Because with the pandemic, we can't go out and do everything like that we used to do. We can have those connections and those supports. And so a lot of it with mental health, maybe being misdiagnosed earlier too within an Indigenous context. So I'm talking about kids that are gifted and they're not seen as being gifted. They're seen as having a slower or lesser the capacity. And so then they may put them on Ritalin or different things, or give them, label them to a certain type of thing with the DSM model. And then they're given prescription medication. Whereas mentally, traditionally, there was a reason for it. There was an understanding for it. And there were things that you would do in nature where you would use the berries or roots or the plants, and you would help with that child, or ceremonies that would be done that would help with that as well. And so those things aren't really, weren't really used before to help our people, and they're just understanding the benefits of it now. Next, with substance abuse, we didn't have addictions back then. We didn't have substance abuse. So with substance abuse, there's process addiction. And so alcohol is something we drink. There's also meth or heroin. So there's substances we ingest, inject, or inhale. And so people aren't really always sure about these substances or what abuse is or addictions. And even work could be an addiction, shopping could be an addiction, eating, relationships, social media, all these things are abuse that people are using. And so when we look at why a person is using or the background to it, we'll see that there's some type of trauma that led up to that point, something that was unresolved, not dealt with. And so the person is numbing the pain. And so they're taking the drug, doing what they're doing to numb that pain so that they don't have to work on it or be in denial of it and not work through that idea. With us, if you look at alcohol, we didn't have alcohol back then. Alcohol used to be called spirit. It also used to be called liquid bread. And if you look at old campaigns, they would talk about how liquid bread was so good for your body or so good to drink. So there's a lot of ways that alcohol was pushed upon our people. And if you look in First Nation communities and at the little towns, and then look how many alcohol stores, convenience stores are nearby that have that access to them. And so then you begin to understand something that's close by where they can cash their check and then they can get that. And then they're going to be using that to numb that pain. And so we have to look at all the ways that things come about, why they come about, the history of it. and what it's doing, the effects that it's having on the body. So with alcohol being a spirit, for our people, we understand it as you're not to do ceremonies or things and for 4 days, because you need that time for that substance to leave your body. And so it'll bring up a lot of different things and ways it impacts with substance addiction, the breakdown of family, the family roles, people that are enabling the family member, harm reduction. There's always a discussion about that. Harm reduction, one is that if you have harm reduction and you're supplying them with needles, clean needles at the health center, but then two, if you're going and buying them clothes and stuff and then they're selling that. So one is giving them the safe needles so that two, they're not sharing needles with someone. Three, they're not in an unsafe environment getting that needle. Four, they're not getting into a fight after. Five, that they're not overdosing. And so when you have these clinics that do harm reduction, the goal of that is that you're helping them medicate in a lower dose in a safe place. And people don't always understand what harm reduction is. Enabling would be buying somebody's stuff, clothes, them go and selling it, and then getting the money and then going and buying the drug off the street. And so people aren't always aware of what enabling is and what harm reduction is. And so I just wanted to point that out because that's one of the things that comes up between harm reduction and what it is. Another thing that always goes with drug use or drug trafficking, because if you live in a community and a lot of the people are dependent, they don't have vehicles, they have low income, there isn't a lot going on, there's a lot of poverty, loss of jobs, there's a lot of turmoil, there's a lot of crisis. We had our flood back in 2013 and I was volunteering there and I was asking them, what are we going to do after all this? And what I meant was there's flooding, people are going to be thrown out of their houses, there's going to be mental health, there's going to be emotional, social, economic issues. And then finally, years later, we're in a crisis now. We're having overdoses, we're having meth, we're having heroin, we're having gangs come in, we're having human trafficking. And so all these things come as a result of what had happened earlier. So with drug trafficking coming into the community, people selling, our own members selling to people, along comes with that is drug trafficking, human trafficking, and gang-related activities. So people are in these gangs because it's a sense of identity, because back when the family used to be intact, they had their kinship, they had their identity, they had their connection. But because of intergenerational trauma, the residential school cut off that connection with talking to your siblings, going back to your home, having those birthdays, having those rites of passages that identified you and helped strengthen you to become a strong man or woman. These were all taken away. So gangs came in, they start bringing drugs in, they marry into the community, they befriend the community, they get jobs, they do businesses in the community, and then they start looking out who are the vulnerable ones, who are the ones that have less than or having family issues, that are in poverty, that there's a single parent in the family. What are all the signs? There's signs that they look for and who they're going to be approaching to take under. And then when they do that, then they'll start doing the drug trafficking. They'll run for them, do the selling. And then with that is also the human trafficking. And so we see that a lot in communities, and we see that with missing and murdered Indigenous women. This last summer, we had a lot of vehicles of another race coming into our community and turning off. And there was an incident where two Stony girls were riding on their quad. They were able to get away because they knew the back roads to get away from these two vehicles with men in them that were trying to take them. And so even just yesterday, a friend shared a post on that of trafficking. I do a lot of work in human trafficking. I work with Reset's based in Calgary, and they're the rapid exit from sexual exploitation and human trafficking. And so the women are being trafficked at a young age. It's probably about 12 to 14 is the average age. They move them in stables, they call them, around to different towns. So like Edmonton, Lloydminster, Calgary, that will be a triangle. That'll be an area, or Vancouver or Manitoba. They'll drug them up. They won't know where they are. And so they keep moving them to keep them so that they can't go for help. And a lot of the women are thinking that this person was their boyfriend and that they were going to be in a relationship, and then they get drugged into this, or they already have a substance abuse issue going on and this person is just feeding it. And so all these things come about. And then when they're trafficked and that person is dating them, talking to them and luring them in, they buy them things, they take them on a date, and then after they tell them, well, you have to pay for that date now, or you have to pay for those clothes I gave you, and then they give them an amount. And then it's so manipulative with the thinking. The women are thinking, okay, I got to make this amount, I got to make say 500 or something, and they never get to that amount because then they put something on it. Oh, you're dressed like this, or you didn't lose weight, and they keep adding to it and they keep increasing that amount. And then the lady is never getting at that amount to what she can get free from. And she's always thinking, okay, I have to get to this, I have to do that. And then in worst case scenarios, her family will be taken as payment. And so then they're threatening your family, the life of your family members, to pay off those debts. And sometimes when we see in communities, women that are family members that have passed away because of unusual circumstances, it's usually paying off a debt for that trafficker, for that drug user. Justice needs to come a long way in that. They would charge the working girl, the girl, and put her in jail, but they would never charge the pimp. And so we have to go a long way in turning that around from one of the oldest things of trafficking or of prostitution, and thinking about it and what it does to our women. And there's signs that we look for. I could probably do a whole workshop on that, on just trafficking and missing and murdered. But for the trafficking, the women, they don't have a lot of trust anymore. They're used to being told everything to do in control mode. So it's very hard for them to get away from that, to be in something different and to be doing things on their own. And then with that comes falls into the sexual violence. Because of our intergenerational trauma and what the nuns and priests did to our ancestors with the sexual abuse, emotional abuse, spiritual abuse, that it continues in our family members. They continue it on because they think it's normal, they think it's love. And so then we have people that are being shown at a young age to be sexually promiscuous, or to have a lot of experiences sexually, thinking it's okay when it isn't. And so that sexual violence of being used in that way, being trafficked in that way. And so it takes away our Indigenous ideology of women and how women are life givers. And it takes away that essence, because if we think about energy with people, we have energy when we meet people, and we know automatically right away that's positive or negative. And when a person has so many sexual partners with her, that is an increased amount of trauma, of issues that she's carrying, that she's bringing on. And if it isn't done in an energy that isn't good, so when you're having a relationship with someone and you love them, then you're giving that love. But if it's in the way that prostitution is done or trafficking is done, it's not in a healthy, positive way. A lot of times it's negative, and there's a lot of physical abuse to it. And so we have to remember that with our women and our children going through that. Also with prisons. Prisons, again, like I was saying about the justice system, it doesn't work. It's man-made laws that they change ever so often to fit their need. So if you look at a bill or what they're doing, then they'll have all these things to it and they'll change it, they'll amend it, and they keep doing that. Whereas we have natural law, we have universal law, we have earth law, we have these different laws that are with us that we have. So sharing is a natural law. So for me to do the work that I do, it's part of natural law, because if I keep all this information with me and something happens to me, this information is not shared. And so what's been shared with me, I share with others because it's natural law. And so I hope I'm making sense with that. But those are Indigenous ideologies that we use. And within the prison system, if you look at it, a lot of the times that an Indigenous person is accused or charged with a crime, he's under the influence. There's substance abuse, there's something going on that made that crime happen. Majority of the time when a non-Indigenous person is charged, they're sober when it happens. And so there's a little bit of things that you have to consider when you look at the justice system, when you look at the laws and acts and the way it came about. It came from colonial ideology of ways that they wrote up the laws. They brought their laws here because when they were trying to settle and make their way across Canada, because everybody was doing the race for the land and they were trying to lay the tracks. So then they did treaties 1 to 11. And as they're doing those, they're clearing the plains so that they can claim the land. So when they're doing that and they're sending their workers out, the Indian agents, to these areas and where they're going to set up as the reserves, those Indian agents needed some type of law to be there with them, the RCMP, the RCMP to be with them as their law. So right then they brought their law from Europe, put it over here without even talking to us and seeing what our laws were. And like I said, we already had all these laws that we followed already. And so when you look at the justice system today, even words that they use in cases. So if there's a sexual abuse case, they use fondling. Fondling doesn't interpret the way it's supposed to. And so you have to look at the English language, understand it, and then see how they use it in instances. For someone getting charged with it, you have to understand what the word fondling is. And so for them, it's acceptable because of the way it's worded. For us, as Indigenous people, we had a different type of language. We didn't have terms that described abuse, alcohol, violence, sexual abuse, all these things. We didn't have terms for those because we didn't operate in that way. And so with prisons and understanding it, we really need to do a lot of work. And until Canadian government or people want to say, let's rework on this, let's see what we can do. The things that have come about that have helped are the Gladue report that looks at the person's background of all this intergenerational trauma to help them understand what were the factors that this person was going through. And so that's a good start to have those Gladue reports. We need to have more of them done. We need to have more people trained in how to do them. We also have sentencing circles, which is, it can be, depending on how it's done, it'll correlate to the Indigenous way of dealing with things. And so everybody's different in how they do it. Everybody has different teachings. They have different languages, different ways of being. And so we really have to, we can't say, oh, this sentencing circle is going to work for everyone. It won't, because you're different depending on your language, your land base, and your resources. So over here, for me, I would have a totally different land base from someone in the East and what my sentencing circle would be. And so we have to look at those things and we have to be aware of it. We can't make a generic copy of something for sentencing circles that's going to help everybody, because it won't fit. And there's so many things that they do. They create all these books, or they're talking about doing Indigenous curriculum in schools now and what they're going to bring. they should do it to the treaty area or to that area that they're in and talk to the Indigenous people, get their history, and teach that to those children in that area so that they're learning. That's one way to do it, rather than a generic thing of talking about teepees and fry bread. Not everybody lives in a teepee. Not everybody makes fry bread. So, but these are just some of the things that we need to talk about. Homelessness and housing. So dislocation of the spirit, dislocation of the person and where they're at. So they went to residential school, they came home, they didn't have a home anymore, they weren't allowed to come home. Also with that, if we look at homeless or housing, for us as Indigenous women, those that lived on the plains, we had the teepee, and we took care of the teepee. We owned the teepee. You bring in a Westerner's concept, you hear that quote, "A man's home is his castle." So the man reigns with the house. For us, that isn't it. And so that's why we have shelters now. And I had worked at a shelter, and I would always think, why are we bringing in these women with their kids? They're completely bringing them out of their element, their routine, their home, their safety, and they have to stay here in a different place, a foreign place, sleep here, try and figure out things within 21 days, and then the guy gets to stay at home because the home is in his name. And that isn't our traditional thinking. If we had our teepee up and we weren't getting along with our partner and that was it, we would have his stuff outside the door, and he would know when he came back, he's out of the house. And so again, different perspectives in the way we do things, in the way we live, in our kinship and our identity. Also with health, again, we understand it with the medicine wheel, the emotional, mental, physical, and spiritual, that those all have to be intact, that we all have to be working on those for ourselves. But with family members too, we can see where there are issues coming up. And so when we do the medicine wheel of our family and of ourselves, and then we know what we need. But a lot of times this isn't looked at. If you look at early ways of looking at health experiments that they would do before with the skull drilling things into the skull to get the bad spirit out, whereas we had an Indigenous way of ceremonies that we would do, teachings that we would do, rites of passage that we would do, things that we would do to help our people. And so those are just being understood now. And we really have to thank those that were in residential school and our ancestors that stayed with it, that had to do the ceremonies in hiding, in underground ways to keep it going, because that's what we have now. And we still have those ceremonies for our people to have their identity, their kinship, and their language, which is so important, because when you have the language, you're able to talk about who you are as a person, how you're related to your family members, and that kinship, that belonging is there. And if the most impact of intergenerational trauma is the disconnection of everything, the splattering of all these things that were interwoven together. So if you look at a spider web and how everything's connected, and then just all of that being decimated, all those connections, all those things being taken away, the kinship, the land, the resources, not being able to pick sage for yourself, for mental wellness, not be able to have that to give to a friend who needs it, who just lost someone. And so these are all the things that compound our people daily. You'll have somebody dealing with child welfare or a family member. You're going to have someone dealing with PTSD. You're going to be having all those health issues, homelessness and housing, really now too with the pandemic and people fighting and realizing, being close with someone in that relationship and saying, okay, I don't want to be in this relationship anymore, and relationships ending or somebody getting kicked out. And so all these things are really prevalent today. I hope I answered enough for you. And so I didn't know how much time I had, so.
That's good. But thank you for all that information and perspective. Teresa does a lot of work with different communities throughout Alberta and in different parts of Canada working with community wellness, working with intergenerational trauma, working with some of the traditional parenting and other types of assistance to help nations reconnect with their traditions, with their beliefs, and how they do things. We'll go to Bev, who is our member from the Indigenous Council, and who also, we talked a bit, and we wanted to do something where we talked a little more in depth about the intergenerational or trauma and the lateral violence portion of that, and why that is so prevalent in our communities, and what we are working towards when we try to reach a mode of reconciliation in and amongst our own people, and trying to find a wellness within that. So Bev.
Thank you, Tony Haichka. Just going to start off with what is lateral violence, just a definition. So Teresa gave us a very good explanation of what is lateral violence, but I'm just going to read to you a definition that we have here. So lateral violence is a form of bullying, which has been explained as the organized harmful behaviors that we do to each other, collectively as part of an oppressed group, within our families, within our organizations, and within our communities. So lateral violence is a worldwide occurrence with all minorities, and particularly Indigenous groups. It's directed sideways, which is lateral, meaning the aggressors are your peers, and often people in powerless positions. It's your own peers who bully you. So lateral violence is the expression of rage and anger, fear and terror that can only be safely vented upon those closest to us when we're being oppressed. In other words, people who are the victims of a situation of dominance turn to each other instead of confronting the actual system that oppresses them. And that largely would happen in Indigenous communities because of what happened in residential schools. So in the residential schools, you have violence that is happening inside those schools between adults and children. And then, so it would be teachers or adults to students, and then there's student to student abuse. So there's obviously a lack of safety, limited social supports, and proper socialization. Lots of the students there would have a lack of basic needs that were being met. And we hear a lot of residential school survivors talk about being hungry or not having what they need while they're there. Personal experiences of abuse and trauma at the residential school when they returned home. Abuse became common and witnessed regularly at the residential schools or at home. Personal experiences of abuse prior to residential school and after. Perpetration is taught and encouraged by the staff, and students would have done it to survive. So the students would have attacked the other students to survive. It's survival of the fittest in the residential schools. From what I've heard in stories from my grandparents, all four of my grandparents attended residential schools. Two of them at St. Michael's, one at Kokolitsa, and I think another one at St. Paul's residential school here in British Columbia. I don't think it was a good experience. I can tell I have intergenerational trauma myself, which means that I already come ingrained DNA. I have PTSD, that's ingrained in my DNA. Because of what was passed down from my grandparents to my parents to me. So all of the after effects of residential schools results in lack of protection, trauma, which is reactivity, modeling normalization, results in a lot of anger and frustration. And they need somehow to figure out a way to restore the power and control that they've lost to these people who are either the perpetrator or the victim. So a lot of times for the children I would say for the children at the residential schools, for those that were being victimized, there would be a lot of feelings toward confusion, towards perpetrators in that school. It would be confusing to have an adult abuse you. It would be confusing to have another student abuse you. As you know, if you're thinking about a small child and we're talking about residential schools, and you have children going to residential schools at the age of 5, I can't imagine what that would be like. You would be confused because, of course, you're separated from your parents, your grandparents, and your community. You've lost absolutely everything, and you're in a school with complete strangers, and you're being told you can't speak your language. You can't talk to your brothers and sisters in there. One of the residential school survivors that I know here in British Columbia, she does the blanket exercise with me, Joanne Haney, had shared that she was severely punished for saying hello to her brother and her sister inside that residential school. Like, when I say severely punished, she was beat. She was beaten with a stick and told to never do that again. She was never allowed to speak to her siblings. So they couldn't even look at each other or talk to each other and or console each other. And in fact, she told me a story that one of her younger siblings came in after she had already been there, and the school couldn't console her. And they actually broke the rules, brought her down to console her sister, and her sister couldn't be consoled. It was a really devastating thing, and they actually perpetrated her to bully her sister, and that has stuck with her whole life. She feels a lot of guilt and shame for having victimized her own sister in that residential schools. So for them, that modeling becomes normalization of behavior, a way to survive, a way to restore power and control that they've lost. So lots of those kids would feel shame, self-blame, anger, frustration, despair, hopelessness, helplessness, because what are you going to do for somebody who is being victimized? You're powerless as a 5-year-old to help another student who's being abused either by an adult or another student. What are you going to do? Who are you going to tell? And who's going to do anything about it? And on the flip side, if you're a perpetrator, we look at the difficulty that residential school survivors have in sharing the abuse and the perpetration and experiences they've had at residential schools. I can tell you that my grandparents, not all of them shared their experience because they weren't able to. I can tell you that 2 of my grandparents were able to talk about what had happened, but one of those stories came from a third party about what had happened. With my grandfather, he shared his residential school survival story with my father, and my father shared that with me also. And so I can tell you it was not a good experience, that it had severely impacted him as an individual, as a child, as a youth, as an adult, as a grandparent, makes them incapable of connecting to their children, to their grandchildren, to their great-great-grandchildren. How do you love when you don't know how? And you've been victimized and re-victimized over and over and over again. That love is never shared. And I can tell you that I'm a 3rd-generation trauma survivor, and I've never heard my parents tell me, oh yeah, I love you, or I'm proud of you. Even before my dad had passed away, he had a hard time hugging me. He couldn't do it. But I'm sure he did his best in terms of trying to do the best that he could with what he had. So perpetrators would do different things to maintain power and control. They would have power and control issues. There would be continued perpetration. So the perpetrators, the victims of that would be the re-perpetrator or the bully. They would have a lot of anger and frustration, guilt and shame, and they also would normalize that abuse. And all of this results in very unhealthy relationships. And there's a deep, deep silence about the residential school survivors' abuse. Lots of them aren't capable of sharing their survival stories with everybody because not all of them have health and wellness, and that's okay because it's a journey and everybody's different and it's different for everybody. You know, God willing, we're able to have healing and health and wellness and share that with our families. So for me, I'm very grateful to my father for sobriety, for AA. I'm grateful for living a life of the red road, but I'm also very, very grateful for the ability to heal by coming back to culture and healing through my culture. So it first brought me to AA looking for a higher power, something more, something spiritual. So church was a good place. I got to read the Bible and learn about the good news, and it helped me to relearn how to live my life on good terms. And it was kind of like a good moral compass of how do I live my life in a good way? How do I walk and be good? And then the other part was I was always searching for that something more. And for me, that something more was my culture. And it was my minister who told me, you need to go back. And so for that, I'm very grateful also because it connected me to my uncle who I did Sweat Lodge, Native American Church, Sundance, and also to my other uncle at the Shaker Church. And I don't do Longhouse, but Shaker Church I go to quite regularly. And I'm grateful for those things because that made me feel whole. Even in all of my brokenness, I could feel somewhat whole, that I had a group of people that loved me even in my brokenness. And thank goodness for that, because that means I can give my children something different. And thank God for my dad who said, if you know better, you do better. And so with that health and healing, I hope that I've shared enough with my children that that might help them. So I have 3 children. One of them is 30, lives in Ontario, has 4 children. They are doing the 1492 land back and they are land defenders. So they have that fire in their stomach. And I'm very grateful for that because they're very strong in their culture. They speak the language, they're out on the land and they're defending. So Haichka for that, it's a beautiful thing. And then I have a middle child who is a drug addict. And so life is not perfect. You know, we do our best and sometimes things just go off the rails. And I appreciate the impacts that Teresa was sharing about because that also impacts our children. My middle child is a drug addict and it's very hard because she has a concurrent disease. So she's got mental health, but also addiction. So prayers for her and her health and wellness, and knowing that all I can really do is pray and love her and be a good role model for her and hope that one day that she can see that I'm working hard to be healthy, that I'm working hard in my wellness, and that I've shared enough culture with them that they know where to go when they need the help that they need, whether it's church, Shaker Church, Sweat Lodge, Sundance, to find that healing path. And then our youngest is 26 and she's getting into starting in January, her DDS, going to be a dentist. So I'm very grateful. We've put a lot of effort and energy into living healthy and well and being well. I know that she is the byproduct of that. She's gotten a lot of love, a lot of support. My dad was her biggest supporter and her biggest cheerleader, and he won't be here to see her finish. But I know that he's with her in spirit. So I'm grateful for that. But there's a lot of work ahead of us. We have to have lots of dedication and commitment to health and wellness. It takes 7 generations to break that cycle of residential schools, and remembering that residential schools began in the early 1820s and the last one closed in 1996, which is not that long ago. And so we have a long ways to go before we have health and healing, but we have to realize and recognize where that dysfunction and those lateral violence come from. So I wanted to share kind of a little bit and give you a little bit of my story so you have an understanding, because all of those things that happened at residential schools were things that came back to our communities, to our families, and how it impacts our families. We have very unhealthy relationships with each other. There's silence and isolation, and those are the worst forms of abuse. We have unhealthy leadership. Unhealthy leadership means you have an unhealthy community. And when I say unhealthy leadership, I'm talking about the leadership of the day, the ones that are elected to govern our communities, that the lateral violence in our communities gets re-perpetrated. So they become the perpetrators and abuse some of the community members. And you have to remember exactly what Teresa was talking about. In our communities, we have that lateral violence in our communities. So to get back to that lateral violence, I'm just going to talk a little bit about the forms of that lateral violence. That lateral violence includes nonverbal innuendo, raising eyebrows, face making, verbal affront, overt, covert, snide remarks, lack of openness, abrupt responses, undermining activities, turning away, not being available, withholding information, sabotage, deliberately setting up a negative situation, infighting or bickering amongst ourselves, scapegoating particular family members, backstabbing, complaining to peers and not confronting the individual. So a lot of like lateral, so talking to each other and talking about each other instead of to each other, that's the healthy way. Failure to respect privacy and a lot of broken confidences. And so really, you know, the impacts with lateral violence is the oppressed become the oppressors, and we've internalized the pain of the colonization and our oppression, and we've taken it back into our communities, into our families, and it's very, very hard to fix. You know, the government can't fix the issue, and the solutions have to come from within that community. And the Aboriginal people, taking control and addressing the issues themselves. That means that for every individual community, they have to resolve those issues in and amongst themselves. And I also need to share with you that we have 638 First Nations across Canada. Every single one of them is absolutely unique, independent. I come from two different communities here in British Columbia. They are not at all alike. They have different culture, different language, different protocols, so I can get it wrong all the time. So for those that are settlers and you're afraid to, you know, talk to local Indigenous communities because you think you're gonna get it wrong, I encourage you to get it wrong, and it's okay. Because, you know, we're only going to learn about each other if we talk to one another and try to learn about one another and what's been happening. But that lateral violence really does have to be addressed, because it's a lot of hurting. Like even in my own personal story that I shared with you, I didn't actually share all of it, but I can tell you that because of residential schools, there was a lot of abuse in my family. Emotional, mental, physical, sexual, psychological, spiritual abuse. So for me, it was really devastating to be brought up in this type of environment. It took a lot of dedication and commitment to get clean and sober, so that I didn't want to numb myself, so that I wanted to have a better life for myself. And I'm so grateful to my dad for doing that. And I remember, like, one of the girls were about 5 years old. My dad he had always repeated this to them as they were getting bigger. You know, if you girls could be clean and sober your whole life, I could die a very happy man. And I'm grateful to him for that, because, you know, we've got 2 out of 3 that are doing just that and living life in a good way. And I want to thank my uncle, even though he's not here, he's in the spirit world, for loving me in my brokenness and loving me back together in all of my goodness, and remembering that I have gifts to share. And there's so many things to learn and places to go. But I think that we need to really look at where this dysfunction and behavior comes from. It was perpetrated in these residential schools, and these are the things that we have learned there. But that culture can help us to heal, help restore who we were. And I really, really like it when my Uncle Gene from the Shaker Church shares about our faith, our Shake faith, that we knew about God and Jesus before the colonizers came. It's in our songs, it's in our protocols, it's all a part of our community. So for us, you know, he always shares that there's nothing wrong with the way that we were when people arrived. They just think that we're so different. They forget that in our humanness, we're more alike than we are different. And that there was nothing wrong with the way that we prayed. And one of the things that he always says is, I don't care how you pray so long as you pray. I get a lot of flack in my community for being Christian, for participating with the church. But for me, the church has helped me to heal, to help me bring back and help restore who I am. And I'm really grateful for that. Without the church, I couldn't have the healing that I need today. So for that, I say, Haich Kachesiam. Those are very important things. So I hope that you learned a little bit today. And I don't know if you guys have any questions. Over to you, Tony. Thank you.
Hi. Thank you, Bev. Thank you for Teresa for the words and the instruction. I'm glad on this day of the Orange Shirt Day that we can turn to two women and learn from them, because when we grow up on our reserve, we have a veneration of women, we have a veneration of women's teachings and the role of women who are instructors, who are the knowledge keepers for the family and tell us how to live, how we live and how we believe and what the future is for our people. They're the knowledge keepers, they're the knowledge givers. And so we hear from them some of the information that it's taken a lifetime to bring together, and a lifetime of experiences, a lifetime of understanding, to know and understand that things are difficult and we have ways of working within that. And both, and we'll get into this in a little bit, connect to some of those traditions. And within our traditions, in the ways that our ancestors dealt with issues of discrepancy and infighting and trauma, there were ways and traditional leadership to combat some of the situations that we see today. And with things like the Indian Act, with things like Indian Act governance systems, we fractured the communities and we've taken away that role of traditional leadership from community members, from hereditary people who take on that role, and from women who are silenced by a patriarchal system that won't allow them to operate as they would normally operate, which is as caregivers, as leaders, as people who influence the way that our communities shape and how we live in and amongst one another. And so in this work, it's very rewarding to see that those voices still exist, and that we are doing in areas like this, allowing those voices to be lifted up, and to know that all those that are gathered here are partaking of that, because we need to reconnect in this TRC time, the time after the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, to repair some of the things that were undone. And so in this way, this knowledge, expertise, the drive to see things that are not right and see things that need to be changed can be part of this journey and part of sharing. So one of the things that I think that we'll do is at least, and thank you for the patience for Margaret for that question. We'll get to that question now, and we will be able to offer other times for questioning. People who want to share. I'll have John and Gloria, who are here as well, to share a bit and from what they've heard and what their perspectives are. But first we'll get to the question from Margaret, which was, I have a question about the residential schools that were on reserve. were those children still separated from their families like those that were at schools far from their communities? And short answer, I'll throw this in there and people can add to it. Short answer is yes. My Aunt Glenda, who has participated in some of these discussions before, is a residential school survivor, and she was on the at the McDougall residential school on the Stony Reserve, and was not able to go home, was not able to learn from her people or take part in some of the cultural things that were necessary because of the way that system was set up. And she endured the same trauma, abuse, ritual beatings and things like that that affected her whole life. And so that's one instance. Does anybody else have anything to add? I think Bev was talking about that as well.
Yeah, I think that from what I understood, I think it would be different all over the place. I think like for a lot of, like for my grandparents, they were sent away far away from home. Even for Joanne Mahaney here in Squamish, she was sent far away. She was sent to Kamloops instead of to St. Paul's, because there was that fear they might return to the community. And Squamish, I don't know if you know where St. Paul's is. St. Paul's residential schools would be in North Vancouver. And so that's where our reserve is. And instead of sending them there, they sent her to Kamloops, her and all of her siblings. I think it's quite different because, I mean, even I think Ray, he's our co-chair for BC Native Ministries. He had said he initially had attended here in the province, but then and then as he got older was shipped to Alberta for residential schools. So I think it can be different for all of them. But I think a lot of the times you often hear stories of different survivors from all over Canada that have different stories about, you know, trying to return home and like dying while they're trying to get home, either freezing to death or, you know, just somehow getting killed on the way trying to go home. Anyhow, yeah.
Thank you. Teresa, do you want to add to that?
Yeah, I think it's just dependent on your area and what your again what was going on in that area, the resources or things at the time. But a large, like pretty much everybody was taken away from their community. Those that didn't go to residential school, the parents knew and feared for them not coming back and didn't trust the government or the those in the black cloaks. And so they went into hiding with the family, with the kids, and kept them away because they didn't want them to go, or they had other instances of other children not returning, getting sick, dying, not returning. So then they kept those other kids away and they hid with them. And so that much I can add. Okay.
Thank you. John, did you want to add anything here at this point?
Yeah, I'll just add that I was in day school. So even though residential day school at Morley, I'm filling out my form right now, but we were separated. And even though I was not spending the evenings at the residential day school, we still suffered. So mine was physical beatings from the teachers, physical beatings from the students, and when we reported to the principal, there was nothing done. So that's going into my report, my claim for the settlement for residential day school.
Gloria, are you there?
Yeah, it's a very sensitive topic. It's hard to talk about. When I took my aunties to do their application for residential school, they weren't forthcoming with the information. In one instance, even my uncle was questioned and said, you know, did you attend residential school? And he said yes. And you know, they're doing this all in English, and he's predominantly a Stony speaker. And then they had asked him what his life's work was. He was a longtime counselor with our chief and council. And then they asked him, so you had a good life. And he tried to say, after I had a good life. And then they rushed him along. So he didn't get a chance to illuminate what happened in residential school. And as a result, his claim was denied because he had a good life, because he was a leadership, because he had overcame the difficulty. And they downplayed it. And I'm sitting there and I'm seething because they used the English against him. If they would have had said in his own language the horrors he endured, it would have been a very different outcome. So when you see the stories of people, of family, of elders, there's that piece of respect and listening and honoring. And I think a little bit of that is missing from the process that happened with the residential school survivors, who had many elders who were elderly that didn't have English as their prominent language and didn't know how to explain, just like Bev said, they didn't have the terms of how to explain the abuse or have a word in Stoney that explained what happened. It was all in English context. So there is that. And in our hallmark of who we are as Indigenous peoples, respect and Ogichignabi, helping one another, is the hallmark of who we are. We also look at the ideas of responsibility and accepting, when we've made mistakes, or the safety that we keep ourselves safe and sacred, that we don't fall for manipulations, and that we care for one another. We also have the accountability. So when we're going to do something, our word is our bond. Being honest as well, saying what we mean and being honest and telling the truth. A lot of these hallmarks of who we are as Indigenous comes from our values, comes from our societal norms. And this is the foundation of what was taken from us as children. And now as adults and as grandparents, we're still trying to live out the traditional ways, but it's very difficult. Mm-hmm. So now that you have the audience here to speak of the injustices, we now have to look at the healing aspects, the healthy relationships. How are we going to build these? Mm-hmm. We didn't have the foundations to do this.
Yeah. I think one of the interesting things in it is when you mentioned our uncle, he and some of what he endured that he didn't mention. And a lot of times our people are modest, are humble, are not, they don't want to talk about a lot of things. It's like we hear from veterans that come back from wars. They don't want to talk about what happened to them and what they saw, what they experienced, what they had to do. A lot of times they don't want to remember that. And so he had lost each one of his sons. I think he had 6 sons, and each one died under very violent circumstances. One, I think it was his oldest son that set himself on fire in his vehicle. And that was after his wife had left him, after he had gone to drinking, after he had endured a lot of pain, physical, psychological pain. And so we're not hearing those type of stories. And so my uncle didn't want to bring that up and didn't want to talk about that, ended up getting no recognition from the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, and ended up remaining in a situation of poverty and never having any kind of restitution for the pains and the abuses that he did endure during that schooling time and afterwards, having to deal in a community that was broken and set on a lot of abuses upon each other, and continues intergenerationally into the people that we see today. So a lot of the infighting, a lot of the backstabbing, a lot of the situations that we find ourselves in politically are back to that time of people being manipulated and changed in fundamental ways in their personalities to deal with each other. If we have any other questions now, or something that you wanted to add in, anyone, just the mic is open to all of you. If not, I'm going to start calling names.
Tony, I think I might just add that I think it's really important that, you know, we acknowledge the good work that Teresa did and talked about the ways that this continues in our communities, like the murdered and missing Indigenous women and girls, but also child welfare, super important, because we have youth like my daughter who are stuck in addiction and mental health and can't get out of it because they don't understand what's happened, what's being passed down. And I feel like so many of our communities are in that, lacking the knowledge because we've lived in silence and isolation for so long. So not just residential schools, day schools like your brother John mentioned, also 60 Scoop, and now our children in care. 70% of all children in care today are Indigenous. And so we have to remember that the genocide has never ended. You know, I worked in the Child and Family Services, and the number of Aboriginal kids in care, most of them don't know who they are or where they come from. And they've never ever been to the community and never ever connected to parents, family, grandparents, community, and culture protocols, and that's devastating for them. So the fact that we have high numbers of kids in care, but also high numbers of youth suicide, very important, because we're losing young people to either suicide or drug addiction and mental health. They've become the disposable, and we've forgotten, like, even with the residential schools, that the government ask the churches to govern the contract, the assimilation policy. It's just a change of provider, that now we have all of our kids, that the genocide is now being turned over to them because the policy has never really changed. It's still the idea of assimilating our children into Canadian society, not understanding that we're not Canadians, we're Indigenous. So if you were to ask me who I am and where I come from, I would be saying, oh yeah, I'm Squamish, I'm Hamalchison, because that's the village and the land, the Tisha Tameo, to which I belong. And our kids can't say that because they haven't had those teachings. They're disconnected from their land, disconnected from their parents, disconnected from their family, disconnected from their community. And then when they go back to that community, there's no belonging. So we have all of these things that are happening, which make it even harder for anybody to belong. Even me to belong to my community, I don't belong. You know, there's all that infighting that you talked about in terms of that lateral violence, so much about, you know, they don't like me because I'm this way, or because I'm spiritual, or because, you know, they find a reason, and their family's fighting with my family and they don't like me because they don't like that family, you know, and, you know, I looked at them the wrong way, and, you know, they don't like me, you know, and it's hard. It's hard to come from communities that you can't belong to, and I'm supposed to belong to both. And I find it more comforting to be here in Catesy territory, in my home, away from my communities, because the lateral violence is too yucky. Who wants to be around people, places, and things that take away your peace and enjoyment every day? Yeah, thanks, Tony.
Teresa, I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit about the work that you do in various communities around community healing, and what some of those efforts are like, some of the traditions that are carried on, that people are starting to look to in order to repair some of this community trauma, this community dysfunction, and places where some of this work has happened.
Hi. Yeah, I can talk a little bit about that. So one of the things that I do in the work in traveling to Indigenous communities, so I'm a life skills coach as well, and doing the grief and loss, or trauma, grief and loss, because a lot of things are tied into the trauma, and we understand that. And with that, going to the communities and going over if it's grief and loss and trauma for the community, talking to them about that, learning what the signs are, what the symptoms are, how it came about. And so the one thing that I do in all communities is I'll take a flip chart with me, and I'll have like a circle made up, and it's a medicine wheel. And so I'll go into pre-contact, contact, post-contact, and then vision. So pre-contact, talking about how we had our societies, how we had our healers, our leaders, if they were our war chiefs, if it were our medicine people, if it were our warriors, we had all those people who have played certain roles. And then contact, when newcomers came and there was true distinct ideologies and what came from that, the Indian Act, the residential school, the railroads. In there you can see the start of missing and murdered Indigenous women, because if you look up the incident with Frog Lake Massacre, that could be seen as one of the first things of missing and murdered women that happened. Also, you look at our world history at the same time, what else is being introduced? TV is being introduced. This is the TV now as the babysitter, whereas before in pre-contact, we had the family living together, the kinship, the grandma and grandpa taking care of the kids. Then with pre-contact inventions, new things coming into play. So you have the TV as a babysitter. You see the dysfunction. You see the residential school, the 60s scoop happening. Within the Indian Act, different things, like we used to have Bill C-31, where if a Native lady married a non-Native, she lost all her rights. But then if a Native man married, his wife gained all those rights as a Native person. And so all these things that were made to divide us. So we have newcomers that come and invade our land. They engage with us, talk with us, make treaties, do things, and they divide us by coming forth and bringing residential school. And then they evade us after, like not dealing with the responsibilities of treaties or those things that we need to. We're still here. We still need to walk together in a gentle and kind way. And so then you go to post-contact and you see the uproar of poverty, addictions, the conditions in communities, the jobs. A majority of the jobs in my community, for example, are not held by our Indigenous people. A lot of them, they're by people coming into the community, and our people could be having those jobs. Our people could be the directors and managers, but because of that lateral violence that Beverly talked about, we have our people oppressing each other, and that doesn't work. And then our kids see it, and then our kids go into school, and then they only play with certain people because they're being taught that in the home. It's a learned behavior. And so we keep doing that re-victimization because we're getting victimized. And so we keep doing it because it's natural, it's normal now to do that. And then if you look at that within addictions, there is no recovery plan. There is no aftercare plan in communities. You send a person to treatment, they think for 30 days, 60 days, 90 days, or if the person's sentenced. And we know from addictions, a person is gonna either quit the program, they're gonna relapse, they're gonna finish and get it done because it's court ordered and mandated. There's no heart in it for them to wanna do it. A person has to hit rock bottom in order to want to go to treatment, to want to get the help. And as much as we love that person and we want to help them and we'll get them there, we'll do everything for them, that person has to be at that point, their spirit has to be wanting the help. And so when they come back to the community, and this is where community doesn't understand it, they think, oh, they went to treatment, they're going to be okay now. And it's like, hello, no, it's the family and everything around them that has to change too. They need to learn about addictions. They need to learn if it's a process addiction, if it's a substance addiction, what kind of addiction is this family member? What is bothering them? And how am I enabling it? How am I in denial of it? How am I using transference? How am I doing all these things? And so in the community, there's no recovery. There's nothing being done. For the community to learn about the addictions, there's only two detox centers in Alberta. They're full. We basically need a wet, it's called like a wet house or a wet wet center. So that's where the person who's coming down, who's coming off the high, they go to that place. There's workers there who are trained, and they make sure that that person doesn't overdose or die. They also have that place as a place to make food, coffee, to warm up. And so wet centers are needed in all our Indigenous communities. A sexual abuse unit is also needed in all our communities. We know abuse is 3 times as high, so it's going to happen 3 times as much. It's going to be 3 times as violent for our women. So we need those sexual assault centers in our community. We don't need it in the urban area where we're going to drive our client, drive our family member to that center where there's going to be a non-Indigenous person talking to them about what's going on, and be really desensitizing the assault and what happened to them. And so we have to look at these things. They're happening in our community. We need these things in our community. We don't need them in urban areas. We need them for us to work as healers in our own community. We know we've either experienced it, we've worked through it, through our trauma. We're helpers now in our community, and we know what our community needs. And so a lot of this isn't talked about, and we keep saying, oh, they have to have a certificate, they have to have a degree. We give no ounce of recognizing a person's natural gift as a healer, as their Indigenous ideology. That's the gift that they have for maybe song, for healing, for talking. We don't understand, or newcomers don't understand that. And so then when we have all these things happen for our people, we have to make ways for them. So when we go into communities and we work through grief and loss and trauma with people, we work with them as to what their resources, it's like safety planning with them. And we'll do that within a medicine wheel context. Their emotional needs, spiritual, if there's church that they can go to, if there's a healer they can go to, if there's sage, they can pick what are those things that are going to help them. So we help them do a safety plan in that way in the communities, which gives them ownership of what they're going to be doing, of what they're going to be doing for their healing and how they see it with other members. Once they see it as a visual, because as Indigenous people, we're visual people. We lived off the land, we watched the animals, we watched for signs from others when we were coming into contact them, and did that sign language as well too. So we're visual people. So when we do our healing in a group setting, when I'm going into communities, I'll do it on a PowerPoint with them, but also do it on flip chart paper, and they'll have their own too that they'll work through. And this is what I see helps the people work through. I also do another one called Winter Count. Everybody does a grief and loss timeline that's linear. I do one that's in a circle, because we understand everything's interconnected in a circle. And so those are the things that we do, my co-facilitator and I, and then that we do, because you have to understand the holistic point of it. You can't leave out parts. Doing it linear is just, it's a line that goes and goes. When you do it in a holistic way, in a circle way, you're seeing how it attaches to this, or what theme comes up here, why this happened at this time of year. And you can also see the epigenetics of it too, the DNA, and how it's reoccurring and where the pattern is. And so those are just some of the things that we do in the community. Another one is using art as a way of healing. And so making dolls that help with the inner child, doing the ribbon skirt making that give the empowerment back to the women in their roles as life givers. And then also with that, I created one that's drawing, that's just art therapy of Indigenous images, because when I was going to communities and doing my workshops, some girls, because of the intergenerational trauma, didn't have the experience of beading or sewing. And so I thought, well, if I color, because coloring therapy is big now, then I start making images like that, and I would take that. And so then they start coloring. And so it's still something therapeutic that we're doing, because we're working both sides of the brain, and they're processing, but they're also working through it with their handwork, with their writing or their drawing. They're physically working through that. And so that's a whole different cognitive area that we could get into, but that'll maybe be another workshop. But yeah, so just those things I think I can touch on for us. Also, I just wanted to point out that AA, NA, SA, Al-Anon, those don't necessarily work in Indigenous communities because we all know each other. We all live in the same community. Everybody knows who's doing what. And so those don't necessarily work. But what does work is having sharing circles in the community, doing our ceremonies, our rites of passage, our feasts, our fall feasts, our giveaways, our Sundance. Those things work because those are what we know to heal and how we communicate with the Creator that we've always had. So,
thanks. I just want to go and touch on one part I think that that we haven't talked about yet, and the idea of, and I'll get John to talk about this, about the divide and conquer mentality of the colonizer, of the oppressor, to take apart some of our institutions and our way of thinking, and to amplify dissent and amplify ways that we don't get along, which are, I mean, we are basically big families on reserve. We're basically interconnected families, generational relatives, and as you were saying at the beginning, when we started, some of the traumas are so far back that we don't remember where this started, but it continues to amplify, continues to escalate when things like people who are losing their homes or losing a place to live, or are targeted in different ways by other community members, then we start to see that amplification by governments to do things like pipeline conflicts, and just go in there and amplify that and change that. And then other times when it's things like the media that affect the ways that things are presented. And so John, in his work in oil and gas, has been working a lot in areas where trying to uphold some of the community vision, and working on, I think, some of the basic tenets, I think, can talk about how he's been able to successfully do some of these things and still maintain the integrity of that community and their belief systems.
Yeah, thank you. I just wanted to say thanks to Bev and Teresa for sharing, and what they're both talking about in the healing to me is to return to the land, to return to the ceremonies. So the land and ceremonies are central, and they're important. And I know we have some of our fellow students from Hawaii on the line here, and I think what the learning will be is that Indigenous healing will come from the Indigenous ceremonies. So as we look at how we address people, whether they're incarcerated or victims of different crimes, or they're trying to recover from residential school pain and suffering, I think there's a real healing in returning to the land. So work that Teresa's doing, work that others are doing, along with Bev, addressing those ceremonial aspects, create a healing for the people. It's a healing path that wasn't allowed there before. So if we look at the history, when McDougall first came, it was actually, he was the second person bringing the word, and the original word was Henry Bird Steinhauer that came. So it was an Ojibwe who brought the word. And so the way he brought that word was delivered to the Indigenous people in such a way that they accepted that. One of the things that McDougall did, though, was he warned us at the time of the mid-1800s that the buffalo were going to be slaughtered. And so we had to prepare for all this trauma that was coming amongst all the Indigenous people, that the buffalo would be slaughtered, they would disappear, and somehow we would have to survive. And so that was one of the advocacy of the church, to help us prepare for an onslaught of abuse. And so there's a role for the church today to advocate, to support, to help in the healing, to help with all the abuses that were done, colonial legislation and post-colonial work that's being done now. So there's a role for those churches. And what they need to do is they need to listen. They need to listen to the elders. They need to listen to the Indigenous students. They need to listen to the Indigenous women's groups about how they want to heal. Many times they tell us, well, go to a psychologist, go to a therapist, which is good. But we still need healing with our traditional people. We still need healing with the elders. We still need healing with the ceremonies. So returning to the land and to the ceremonies is going to be central for the healing for all people, and to understand our role with taking care of Mother Nature, to learn the songs of the land, to learn the prayers of the land, to understand what the Creator has given to us. So it's only by returning to the land that we're going to understand these things. And whether that's a Sundance or a potlatch or the real traditional luau, that's what needs to be practiced and shared. That's what has to be developed among all Indigenous people. I just finished a project with the Maori, and the Maori in New Zealand are looking to make stronger connections with the Indigenous people in Canada. And so there's a time coming when we're going to all unite, whether that's the Maori, the Hawaiian, the Indigenous people of the Americas. That time is coming, and that's part of the prophecy. And when that happens, we're going to realize our healing. So I think I encourage everybody to keep sharing their stories, keep telling their stories, and keep working on your healing, because each one of you that heals yourself, you will heal the community as well. Thank you.
Thank you. And I think that part of the work that John does is in some of the oil and gas and other work, and even the work in the church, is related to bringing to light and the commitments of the TRC and UNDRIP, the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People, and how those form a foundation upon which we can start to build the better relationship. They are the words that are there before there are any words. And so this space of agreement, this space of trying to follow in a better way, with some of the guidance of our elders, these documents and these struggles have been going on for generations. And we've seen the inkling of that began in the 1970s with our ecumenical conference continue on today. So what I'd like to do at the end here, we have a few minutes. I'd like to go around the room and just get maybe a one word or something that resonated with you, some idea that you wanted to share here, and we'll start with Carolyn. I'm just going alphabetically, I think, on this list.
Hi.
Hi.
Can you hear me? Hi.
Yeah.
So I'm a 60 scoop child.
Mm-hmm.
So I was raised actually in a non-Indigenous family, and I grew up in the Lutheran church. And in my 20s, I found my birth family, and it was not a good thing.
Mm.
It was a terrible reunion. Found a lot of bad things that had happened to my birth family. And unfortunately, it was, generational trauma, probably from residential school, some things like that, but I don't really know. Because I was sort of like the outcast and no one knew who I was. So they treated me differently but after, years and years of counseling, I realized that, you know, for them, maybe it was hard because I didn't experience what they went through. And, it brought me, to tears of what happened to them. But it still affected me because I didn't have my culture growing up. So as an adult, I've learned a lot of things.
Mhm.
And, and now, here I am in my church, bringing reconciliation to the church and doing services and doing smudging and, and so I feel so honored that they are finally listening.
Mm.
It's just a little glimpse right now, but, I'm just doing God's work and what He's called me to do, and I'm very excited about it, and that's why I am in the school too. So it's awesome.
Mm-hmm. Great, thank you. We'll go to Clara from Hawaii.
Hi, hello everyone. Thank you all for your courage in sharing your stories. I know this is not a pleasant subject matter. My work is similar. I work with the victims, Indigenous women in Hawaii, of course. Most of them are Hawaiian, but there are others who are Puerto Rican, Filipino, Indigenous, but not necessarily First Nation. And so I had a question earlier. I sent it to Tony. And my question was, and maybe Teresa's already spoken to this, but I came in a little late. And my question was regarding peer mentoring, because what we have discovered is that women who are incarcerated can talk to other women who are incarcerated. They have the same experiences often. Most of them have been abused physically and sexually. Home often is not a place that they can go back to when they're released because that's the origin of the trauma. So I was wondering if in your villages or communities you have something similar to that. Is there an equivalent to peer mentoring in addition to Teresa, you going into a community? In other words, it would be people helping people, your own people helping each other. Is there something like that?
There is something like that, just depending on the community you go into. Within Reset, they do that. So Reset is based in Calgary, and they have peer mentoring there. So Reset is rapid exit from sexual exploitation and trafficking. So they'll have those that have graduated from the program. They'll continue on. They'll be invited to work with the women as well. So they'll do that mentoring, which is in the city in an urban setting. In the communities, like working within the shelters, we'll have workers in there who are helpers doing that in the community. But not every community will have this because of the intergenerational trauma and the politics of it. So often you're going to have a person in a position because they're related to chief and council, and they're not the person with the credentials to do the job, or the healing isn't in their innate calling. And so they're basically there working, and often haven't even looked at their own journey as a way of healing. But when we do this with communities, it's always the hope that they're going to have their healers there too, and that we're helping getting them ready. So kind of like a train the trainer, and then we leave the community, and then they have the tools. They have more added tools to their toolkit in which to help people. And but it doesn't happen a lot in communities, and because of the history of intergenerational trauma, we're just getting to that point now. So like I was talking about a medicine wheel, having the pre-contact, then contact, and then post-contact, and vision. So vision is like truth and reconciliation. So having this done tonight is part of the vision, to talk together, to have ideas, to share. Having Orange Shirt Day is part of the vision, having people understand about residential school. And so these are all baby steps that we're taking. And so as our people heal and everybody's on their own journey, those helpers will find out, they'll have that self-identification, and they'll become the healers. But within that system too, you have to look at what kind of system that is in that community. Is it a colonial system? And a lot of times it is, with their thinking of 9 to 5. crisis doesn't happen 9 to 5. We know crisis happens all the time, and there's traditional ways of dealing with it. So it's the mindset with the ideology as well too, that we have to mentor as well as mentor our own. So I hope that answered your question.
Thank you. Thank you.
One of the things that we get to do in this kind of environment is also speak with other people from different areas. I had a World Indigenous View session in the beginning of August, and got to talk to Vernie Yakogan Diana, who is a person who works a lot with the church partner for the United Church and also in other areas. And one of the things she was talking about was in terms of their youth programs and the youth that they're working with. They had great success pairing the youth with some of the eldership and having them work together, and that really gave a stabilizing balance to the community members and how they interacted and appreciated some of their stories. It was a traditional reconnection that had existed in many Indigenous communities before, but had been severed because of things like technology, things like some of the indoctrination, colonialism, and push towards youth culture in different other areas. So just an interesting takeaway from that. I'll go to the next person. Gloria, go ahead.
Well, to answer the specifics of women that need peer support, I worked with an organization, the Elizabeth Fry Society, and they have these societies all throughout Canada in every major city. And it's an original idea that came from England, where the Puritan Elizabeth Fry was working towards prison reform for women in the system. And so the Elizabeth Fry chapter in our area in Calgary have high rates of Indigenous women who are incarcerated, who come through the system and need supports. So one of the things that we created was a cultural support worker. So they would teach them traditional things off-site or at the Elizabeth Fry offices. They also have in the prison impacts, workers that would go in and do cultural smudging or cultural teachings. We even had one instance where we were able to go in and present the powwow dancing. So I actually went into one of the institutions with a general population of men and women and teach the dancing, teach the culture, and show the inmates that there was connection to culture and to our own self-esteem, self-identity, and celebrating that. So when they learn about it, when they teach about it, and our Elizabeth Fry is one of the first ones that we put on reserve. So I created an office within the old Elders Lodge, and now that Elizabeth Fry is still there. So I trained the next person who is a nation member, Melinda Bearspaw, who works actively to advocate for the women, legal aid, cultural supports, treatment, all of these things that they need in terms of maybe they're court ordered or maybe they need cultural supports that they may not get from NADAP or another program. So it's directly involved with these women that have been through the court system, even to help them do life skills and training and get a cultural background. So that's very concrete, but we had to take it to Elizabeth Fry to bring it to the reserve, to bring it to the women. And we have sister campuses like the Calgary office and now Eden Valley office, which is our other reserve, and Morley. So it's expanding, but it's on the ground, grassroots cultural help for women that are gone through trauma or through abuse or through prostitution, human trafficking through the court systems or have been incarcerated. So yeah, that's just what I wanted to add.
Thanks. We'll go to Donna. And we'll try to go around the room to just get your input, feedback, and yeah, go ahead.
Thank you. Marshall and I just humbly thank you for all your wisdom and knowledge and guidance for tonight. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you to our two speakers that have been generous enough to share a lot of what they've been told and a lot of what they've been wanting to share, I think, with larger communities. Heather, if you're there. If not, we'll go to Helena. The other H.
Thank you so much, Teresa and Beverly and Gloria and John and Tony, for sharing all this. It's been very informative and heartbreaking and also hopeful at the same time, letting us, see the ways that what is happening and how you guys are working to help others. And it really broke my heart when Beverly said that the students in residential schools never learned how to love or felt love. And it's just like, it explains so much of how this is just kept going on and on and on. And I just thank you for sharing. So
Thank you. Thank you. Merle, if your sound is working now, I know that your sound was kind of off.
Yes, I just stuck something in the chat. I have to drive someone, so I'm sorry I have to check out. But okay. I'm so grateful. This has been a really powerful presentation, and I wish it could be shared even wider. So thank you very much to all the speakers.
Marilyn, if you're there.
Hi, Tony.
Hi.
Sorry, I was sitting in the other room. Listen. Oh, I'm just amazed. I've never heard anything like it, and like Beverly and I'm speechless actually. I was here to listen, and that's what I did. And I walked beside, just be alongside the people that are talking today and their loved ones. And thank you so much for everything, for letting us hear this. Thank you.
Thank you. Pat. Pat's not there. We'll go to Sarah.
Yeah, just echoing what's been said. Thank you to each of you that spoke and shared. I also am feeling like I wish there was more white people here. As a white person. I just, I want this to be shared, and I want, it's so good and so rich and so informative, and I just want it to go wider. Something that I'm taking away lots, but something especially that I'd never really understood before was the differences in language. And like that story about your uncle, I think it was Gloria and Tony's uncle, that, that's so heartbreaking that TRC witness was, that conversation that happened and what was left out because of differences in culture and language, and like you said, humility, and like that. It's like it just seems unfair that the onus is put on the survivors to
Thank you. Thank you. We have Strathy, but you said don't ask her a question. So I won't. Who's on the iPhone?
I'm sorry, Tony. I just got on 3 minutes ago, so I missed everything. I just want to be here to support you guys.
Sure. iPhone 403-308-6812. If you're there.
Okay, it's Carol Watt from
Waterton.
Hello.
Yep.
Yeah, hi. And yeah, thank you. And I love when your sister said that Orange Shirt Day is part of the vision, and I see that more and more awareness about it, not so much here in Pinter Creek, but across Facebook for sure.
Good.
Just very well, we can only go forward, and this is a solid way. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I'll call on Bev if you're there. Maybe some closing words, or maybe I'll go to John first, and then if John and Gloria, and then we'll go to Bev. So the last two presenters can kind of wrap up there.
Yeah, thank you. I just wanted to thank everybody for coming and thank Tony for setting this up. I appreciate hearing from Teresa and Bev. And this is the only way that we're going to begin the healing is to start discussing and start sharing our time together. So thank you for listening.
Thank you. Gloria and Ken, if you have last words.
Yeah, I thank everyone, and the wealth and strength of our families here in across Turtle Island really shows the commitment and passion we have, the resiliency to speak of difficult subjects. And like John said, we need to move forward and speak out or have a voice. And I would add to that also some concrete actions. Like Orange Shirt Day is one day out of the year. We now have Murdered and Missing Indigenous Women Day coming up. We have the push for different things. There needs to be a little more in terms of action. Now that we know, now that we're talking about this, what will we do? And how will we help one another in concrete ways? Ken, do you want to add anything? No.
Okay. We'll go to,
echoes that sentiment.
Okay, we'll go to Bev and to Teresa for final words.
Hawkswile and Hawk and Swallowin, Clinic Snob Beverly, I just want to say thank you so much. Like, this has been really good. I feel like these are good ways for our churches to learn about Indigenous issues. And it's about time that we started doing these types of things. This type of work needs to be lifted up. I totally agree with John. We need to live up to the TRC calls to actions and UNRIP. It needs to be action committed, like Gloria said. You need to be dedicated to be the change, that the world is looking for. And John is here in the region new to BC, to the Pacific Mountain region. He's our Indigenous minister. And I'm, for those of you that don't know, I am on the United Church of Canada's boards, locally, regionally, and nationally. So locally, I am on the board of the Longhouse Native Ministries. Regionally, I am on the Pacific Mountain Region Council Executive. I also do the PDCs, which is the Pacific Development Corporations, for all of the real estate properties for Pacific Mountain Region in BC. I'm also the BC Native Ministry co-chair, and I'm also on the National Indigenous Council. So I'm very involved in the United Church, and this is where change is going to happen. And so I think tonight is a good time to ask our churches, whether you're in the region of Alberta, in the Chinookwins, or in the region of British Columbia and part of the Pacific Mountain region, or other parts of our Indigenous ministries across the land, to be really good allies, to listen to our Indigenous ministries, to lift up all of our members of our congregations. Indigenous ministries has 65 communities of faith, and it's really time to lift up all of those people in those congregations, especially if they've been long-term followers and brothers of sisters in Christ. Really important, because that lateral violence that we talked about is really prevalent inside the church. That was a big conversation at our GC 43. It's a big conversation at our regional meetings, at our national meetings for United Church of Canada. And we have to be the change that the world is waiting for. We have to make dedicated and committed actions towards being that change. So for me, churches within the region, churches across the nation can offer programs for culture, language, land, protocol, etc., to help have those reparations be lived out, because 70% of all Indigenous people live off reserves. That means every single one of those people are displaced from land, family, and community. And either whether they're in rural or urban areas, churches can open up a safe space and place for people to belong, offer programs and services to our Indigenous peoples. They could share space with Indigenous organizations to be the change. I know, having worked here in Surrey with Child and Family Services, that if the churches opened up their doors and were able to offer up space to Child and Family Services, we could provide more programs and services for our children and for our youth in care. And space was hard to find in Surrey. There was a lack of it, and those are good ways that the church can do so. They can bring in things like cultural programs like Teresa was talking about. We do things like beading with the kids, weaving with the kids. I did a program with the kids like land back. So we were on the land doing medicine picking, learning about the medicines on the land, bringing it down to the sweat lodge, introducing them to my uncle at the sweat lodge and teaching them about our Indigenous ways to heal, ways that I healed, because I wanted them to feel like they mattered. You have to remember, all of the Indigenous people in Canada feel like they don't matter. And now is the time to lift them up and help them to feel like they matter, because it's so silly that they feel like they don't. But I also have to say that, in my experience, and I'm not old or anything, but that I've had a big wealth of experience in different sectors, that the lateral violence that I speak about in Indigenous communities is also in non-Indigenous institutions, school districts, child and family services, government agencies, and our Indigenous organizations. So Teresa was talking about a lot of that lateral violence between our peers that we work with and colleagues. Because of scarcity, we're all hurting one another. Lateral kindness could go a long way. And I feel like we forget about that. And so I implore people to be better brothers and sisters in Christ, and that, reconciliation requires dedicated actions that are thoughtful and committed, and being united together. And health and wellness is something we all need in our humanness. It is not just something that is relegated and dedicated to Indigenous peoples. It affects all people, because where did we learn this behavior? We learned this in the residential schools through a policy that was implemented by the colonizer and the settlers. So this unlearning and decolonizing of these ways is what we need to do as Indigenous peoples. We need our culture back. And I appreciate Claire's comment about mentors. It does work, I think, in certain settings, but it can't work in all communities because of that lateral violence. Like, when I worked in different sectors, and I was doing Indigenous service for Indigenous children and youth and families, there was that lateral violence between me and my colleagues. And it's really awful. It makes for a toxic place, and it makes it really hard. And then the other thing being is, when we talk about that lateral violence, even too, a lot of the times you're taking an Indigenous position and you're already devalued when you take the position, because it has the label Indigenous, and therefore you're devalued, you're disposable, and you're not worth the same amount of money as a non-Indigenous person providing the same service. But you're essentially providing the same service. So I implore people to value Indigenous peoples and do things differently. Reconciliation, not reconciliation. People like to use that as a political colloquial term. Instead, I would want people to make a dedicated and committed action of doing something different, doing something better. If we know better, we do better, and health and wellness is for everybody, not just Indians. So I thank you for listening, and I hope you learned something, and I hope you enjoyed the evening. I thank you for your time. Hawk Squile.
Thank you, Ishnish. Teresa, for our final.
So in Ishnish, because of Phyllis Webstead, who attended residential school at St. Joseph's in Williams Lake, in 1973 when she was 6 years old, and the t-shirt was taken from her. That's why we have Orange Shirt Day today. Because of her, we have dialogue today to talk about some historical impacts to our people, and we can start the healing now. If healing was easy, everybody would do it, but we can move forward, and ways of that Beverly talked about, we can move forward with that. So tonight it's been very heavy, but uplift yourself with the faith that you have in Creator, with God, the Bible, smudge. Take that tonight. Be gentle to each other and kind to each other, because we don't know when our last day is going to be. And so with that, thank you for the opportunity to share. It's been a wonderful evening and a lot of learning for myself too. I'm glad to be able to sit here on Zoom with my brothers, but also with allies too. So Ishnish, thank you.
Thank you. And so we thank everybody for coming. We thank all you for taking part and participating. We will try to release this as a thing on the YouTube page that I have for the region and for the Urban Indigenous Circle. We continue to promote and work on viable solutions, viable ways of working together. Teresa will be helping us with the workshop that we'll be doing this weekend at the McDougall United Church for the missing and murdered women, a time to have that people can process and do a little self-care at this time of year when it's really heavy. Traditionally, at this time of year is our feasts, as people mentioned, but it's also a time of year where we do something very similar to the Day of the Dead, where we remember and we recognize our loved ones who passed on, our ancestors, and we do specific ceremonies for them at this time of year. And so it is naturally a heavy time, and it is naturally a time when we seek connection, seek healing, seek goodwill, and seek support. And so it's very good to see the people that came out and were able to be here. Hopefully more will continue to support what we are doing. And this is what the purpose of reconciliation will be in the Chinook Winds region of Southern Alberta, for the United Church at least, and the others that are struggling to do the same. And hopefully we'll be able to interconnect and build a stronger voice around this. So thank you for all your participation, all your words of support and help. And so we'll end off with a prayer for everyone to go safely, to be well, to be protected from in your journeys around, that you do not get the COVID-19, and that you are able to help and support your families and be strong for them at this time when there are many who are struggling, many who are weak, many who are feeling not as though they're able to continue, and it's a trying time for everyone. Creator God, we give thanks for this evening, for the voices, for the people, for the heart, and for the connection that we have made in these words and in the work that we do. Pray that you are with us, carrying us forward, and in support of our journey here on Turtle Island. Pray that you are always looking out for us and for our loved ones and for all people who need your help. Jesus Christ. Amen. Go in peace. Thank you.
Thank you.
Amen. Thank you, Tony.
Thank you, Tony.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.